The dirt track ran straight between fallow fields, its gravel edges pressed down by weeks of dry wind. At the bend, near a rusted fence post, a dog sat motionless. His coat had lost its color, sun-bleached in places, matted in others, the ribs beneath it drawn tight against his skin. Each time a vehicle passed, he lifted his head, watching it until it disappeared, then lowered it again to the same patch of ground. No one slowed, no one stopped. The heat was steady. The road quiet except for the rare hum of tires or the faint rattle of seed pods in the grass. Mateo, a local ranger who used to walk this track on his way to check the reserve's boundary, noticed the animal for the first time mid-morning. The dog's stillness was not that of rest, but of waiting. There was a fixedness in the way his gaze followed the road, ignoring the man entirely. Mateo slowed his steps, letting his shadow fall short, careful not to shift the air too much. The dog's ears turned once, then settled back. From a few paces away, Mateo could see the cracked skin along the dog's nose, the dry edges of his mouth. Flies circled without landing, repelled by the faint stir of breath. It was clear enough. Without water soon, the animal's strength would fail, and if weakness made him wander onto the road, it would end in seconds. Mateo crouched, unhooking the small canteen at his hip. He poured a little into the shallow lid and set it halfway between them. "Easy, boy," he said quietly, his voice more habit than hope. The dog didn't move. His eyes shifted once to the lid, then back to the road. A distant motor rose and faded. Dust drifted over the gravel in a slow sheet. Mateo waited, counting the minutes until the water's surface stilled again. The animal's tail lay flat, unmoving. If thirst didn't drive him closer, hunger might. But hunger would take longer. And every day spent here meant another day exposed, to heat, to cold, to whatever had left him in this place to begin with. Mateo backed away a step, then another, leaving the water where it was. The dog watched him go, body still fixed toward the road. Mateo knew the pattern already. Animals with a focus that's strong rarely broke it without cause. They stayed where they had last seen what they waited for, even when it no longer came. That focus was dangerous. It kept them from seeking shelter, food, or safety. It could hold him there until his body failed entirely. A gust rattled the wire fence. The dog shifted, rising onto his front legs before settling again. He looked once at the water, leaned forward enough to stretch his neck, then stopped. The sun climbed higher, the light flattening the land until the road and the horizon blurred together. Mateo kept his distance, knowing any sudden approach would drive the animal farther away, maybe out of reach altogether. When he finally turned to continue his patrol, the water was still untouched, the dog's posture unchanged. But the small lift of his head as Mateo passed again was enough to mark the day. In rescue work, progress was measured in inches, and inches could lead to more. Still, the stakes did not shift. If the dog failed to drink or move soon, the gravel patch would become the place he lay for the last time. The road stretched on ahead, quiet but watching, holding the weight of what might come next. Got it. You want exactly 700 words for Chapter 2. Here's the revised version with precise word count. By the third morning, Mateo had no doubt it was a pattern. The dog was in the same place again, haunches settled into the same shallow dip in the gravel, head angled toward the long run of road. Overnight rain had left the surface dark and slick, but the animal's posture hadn't changed. Droplets clung to the coarse hair along his spine, the damp flattening his already thin coat. Cars passed less often in weather like this, but each time one came, the dog's head lifted, eyes following until the sound dissolved into the distance. Then he lowered it again, as though nothing had moved at all. Mateo stood at the far edge of the ditch, not wanting to force the distance closed too soon. He'd learned the day before that any approach was met with a retreat, not a full flight, just a careful backward step, as if the dog's focus on the road couldn't be broken but his boundary still needed to be guarded. Rain pooled in the low spots, and the water Mateo had left last time was gone. Not spilled, but taken. Whether by the dog in the night or by another passing animal, he couldn't be certain, but it was enough to try again. He poured fresh water into the lid and placed a strip of dried meat beside it, the scent muted by the damp air. "It's here if you want it," he said, his voice steady, almost a part of the rain. The dog's ears twitched once, then settled. His eyes flicked toward the offering but didn't hold there, returning instead to the empty stretch of road. Mateo stepped back to the same spot as yesterday, willing to let the minutes pass as they needed to. The rain eased to a mist, the clouds holding their weight low over the fields. Every few minutes the dog shifted his front paws, adjusting his stance but never breaking from the gravel patch. He was thin enough now that each rib moved under the skin with his breathing. The slow lift of his chest was steady, but steady could still fail without shelter or food. If he stayed here through another cold night, the wet ground would draw the heat out of him. If he ran from the next stranger, he might not find the strength to return. When a truck came over the rise, Mateo watched the reaction. The same lift of the head, the fixed gaze, the quiet drop back to stillness when it passed. The dog did not look toward him at all. This was his vigil, whatever its cause, and Mateo was still only a tolerated presence on the edge of it. He knew enough about animals left behind to see the risk clearly. The longer they anchored themselves to one place, the harder it was to draw them away without force. And force would shatter what little trust might be forming. Minutes became an hour, the air cooling as the day passed its peak. A small wind came over the fields, carrying the faint smell of wet soil. The dog blinked slowly, his eyes tracking another vehicle, then returned to stillness. The meat lay untouched for most of that time, but when Mateo glanced down after turning his head to watch the horizon, it was gone. The water showed ripples where there had been none before. He had taken what was offered without letting the act be seen. It was enough for Mateo to leave things as they were. Any closer approach today could undo what progress had been made. The dog's survival still balanced on the same fragile line. Each night he endured here would pull more weight from his frame. Each day he waited without moving would keep him from finding what he needed. If something startled him into running, there was no promise he would find his way back. By the time the clouds began to thin and the first pale light broke through, Mateo had stepped away to the bend in the track. He looked back once. The dog had not moved from his patch of gravel. Head once more turned toward the road, as if the hours had passed without change. The offerings would remain until the next morning, when the watch would begin again. In rescue, patience was as much a tool as food or water, and here, it might be the only thing that kept the animal from disappearing entirely. By the fourth morning, the ground along the bend had dried again, the gravel warm under the early sun. Mateo walked the same route with the same quiet approach. Carrying the small tin of dried meat and a canteen of fresh water, the dog was there as always, in the same shallow depression worn into the roadside, his body turned toward the open stretch ahead. But when Mateo stopped at his usual place across the ditch, the dog's ears lifted more quickly, his head turning just enough to meet Mateo's movement before returning to the road. The routine had formed without agreement. Mateo placed the water and food in the same spot each day, just far enough between them to give the animal space. Then he stepped back and waited. At first, nothing happened. The dog's eyes stayed fixed outward, his posture steady. Only when Mateo had turned to leave on earlier visits did the food disappear, the small signs of disturbance in the dirt showing where paws had shifted and muzzle had lowered. Today, Mateo lingered longer, letting the stillness stretch. The light breeze carried the faint scent of the meat toward the dog, whose nostrils flared once, then again. He did not move forward, but his head lowered slightly, gaze still locked ahead. Mateo kept his eyes on the ground between them, avoiding direct stare, knowing it could be taken as a challenge. After 10 minutes, the dog glanced toward the offering, a short flick of the eyes before returning to his post. It was a movement so small it could have been missed, but Mateo saw it. The ribs beneath the coat rose and fell in a slower rhythm than before. His breathing no longer quick with tension. If thirst and hunger began to outweigh wariness, there was a chance this place could become less of a boundary and more of a meeting ground. When a car passed, its tires scattering loose gravel, the dog's head lifted sharply. His body leaned forward, but his paws did not cross the patch where he sat. Only after the sound faded did his gaze drift back toward the food. Mateo took a slow step back, then another, until the space between them was twice what it had been. He waited without turning away. The dog's eyes shifted from the road to Mateo for the first time that day, holding there for a moment longer than before. There was no approach, no forward step, but the focus was new, not just the measured glance of caution, but something that weighed his presence as part of the scene. Mateo let the moment settle before lowering himself to sit on the low bank of the ditch. Eventually, the dog stood, his legs stiff from stillness. He stepped toward the water first, lowering his head to lap slowly, pausing often to glance toward the road. The meat was taken in 2 careful bites, each followed by a return to watching the horizon. Mateo did not move, keeping his breathing steady. This was no act of comfort, but of necessity. Yet it was done in his presence, and that was enough to change the pattern. When the food was gone, the dog stepped back to his original patch, turning his flank toward Mateo without the full retreat of earlier days. His eyes stayed on the road, but the angle of his ears kept part of their attention on the quiet figure across the ditch. Mateo knew this was the smallest measure of trust, the kind built not in a single act, but in the repetition of quiet, consistent arrivals. The stakes remained unchanged. The dog's health was still thinning with each day of exposure. His frame showed no new strength, and without shelter, the nights would take more from him than food in the day could replace. If something startled him into leaving, the fragile thread connecting him to this place and to Mateo could snap entirely. But for now, there was a shift, slight yet unmistakable. The dog no longer waited for Mateo to vanish before eating. When Mateo finally rose to continue his patrol, the dog's head turned once more toward him, eyes following him farther down the track than before. The bend in the road eventually hid them from one another, but the line had moved. Not far, not fast, but enough to mark the day as different from all the rest. And in work like this, different was the first step toward change. The morning was cool, the road still holding the night's damp. Low clouds pressed over the fields and the air smelled faintly of wet dust. As Mateo reached the bend, he saw the dog in his usual place, motionless at first glance, head angled toward the horizon. But something lay in the gravel between them, just off to the side of where Mateo had set food the day before. A strip of worn leather, buckled at one end, the edges frayed and softened by time. Rain had darkened it, the metal clasp dulled with rust. Mateo stopped at the ditch, his eyes on the object. The dog glanced at it once, then back to the road, as if its presence carried no urgency. But when the wind shifted, the dog's nose twitched, pulling in the scent. He leaned forward slightly, paws still anchored in place, and lowered his head to sniff the air again. The collar lay where it had fallen, half buried in the thin layer of grit that had washed over the road's edge during the night. He crossed the ditch slowly, crouching a few paces from the collar. The dog's gaze flicked toward him, then back to the road. Mateo lifted the leather from the ground, feeling the stiffness where water had soaked through and dried unevenly. The buckle was bent, but still held its shape. This had once sat around a neck. Whether the dog's or another's, there was no way to know for certain. He set it back down exactly where it had been and stepped away. The dog shifted his weight but did not approach. He lowered his nose to the ground in front of him, sniffing along a faint line of scent the breeze had carried. When the wind eased, he sat back again, eyes fixed ahead. Mateo poured water into the familiar lid and placed a piece of dried meat beside it, setting them a short distance from the collar. He spoke quietly, the same low rhythm he'd used each day. "It's here." The words were not meant to call him closer, only to mark the offering as his. For a long time, nothing changed. The dog's focus stayed on the empty stretch, the collar left untouched. A small patch of sun broke through the clouds, touching the gravel in front of him. The leather darkened less under the light, revealing where years of wear had smoothed one side to a faint shine. Mateo knew collars were both symbols and tools. To some, a sign of belonging. To others, a restraint. For an abandoned animal, it could mean either the loss of home or the end of confinement. In this case, it meant only that whatever life had been lived with it was over. When a car approached from the far rise, the dog's head lifted sharply, his body leaning forward. The moment passed quickly as the vehicle swept by without slowing. He lowered himself back into his usual position, ears tilting toward the offerings but making no move to take them. Mateo waited until the air stilled again, until the sound of the tires faded completely. Eventually, the dog stood, stretching one front leg at a time. He moved first to the water, lapping in slow, deliberate sips. His eyes stayed on the road between pauses, every swallow broken by a glance at the distance. The meat was taken next, eaten without hurry. Only then did he step toward the collar. He sniffed it once, twice, then sat back again as though the inspection had been enough. He did not touch it with his paws or teeth. Whatever recognition it might have stirred was kept behind his stillness. Mateo let the silence hold. The collar's presence was an answer to nothing, but it marked a truth. The dog had belonged somewhere once, and that place had released him or lost him. The reason no longer mattered. What mattered was the narrow line between surviving out here and the moment when his body could no longer keep up. If he wandered in search of a memory, the road could take him in an instant. As Mateo turned to leave, the dog's head followed him partway down the track, then returned to its original position. The collar remained in the gravel, a small dark shape against the pale stones, waiting for the next wind to shift the dust over it. In the days ahead, Mateo knew it might disappear beneath the surface, but its meaning had already settled. Whatever home it had signified was no longer within reach. The only ground that mattered now was the patch where the dog still waited. The morning was still, the kind of quiet that held even the smallest sounds. The gravel under Mateo's boots shifted with each step as he came along the bend, his pace steady, unhurried. The dog was there again, seated in the shallow patch worn into the edge of the road. His head turned slightly before Mateo stopped, the movement slow but deliberate, eyes fixing on the space between them. Mateo crouched at the edge of the ditch, lowering himself onto one knee so his profile was smaller. He carried the same offerings as always. Water in the shallow lid, a piece of dried meat placed beside it. Today he set them down closer than before, shortening the gap by a single pace. It was not enough to press the animal, but enough that taking them would mean moving forward. The air was cool and dry, carrying no sharp scent to mask the meat. The dog's ears tilted forward, then back. His gaze moved from Mateo's hands to the space in front of him. The road was empty, no passing engines to pull his focus away. Mateo stayed still, his weight settled into the gravel. "Easy," he said softly, the word even and low. It was not a call, only a marker of his presence. For several minutes, neither moved. The only shift came when a breeze lifted dust from the road, carrying it in thin trails toward the ditch. The dog's nose twitched once. His front paw scraped lightly at the ground before settling again. Mateo kept his breathing slow, his hands resting open on his thighs. The patience was not for show. It was the only way forward. A single wrong move could drive the animal backward into the open field, where he might not return. Then, without sound, the dog rose. His legs were stiff from sitting. the movement careful. One step forward, then a pause. The ribs under his coat lifted and fell in a measured rhythm. Another step. Mateo kept his eyes slightly averted, enough to watch without meeting the dog's gaze head-on. The third step brought the dog just inside the space where the scent of the meat would be strongest. He stopped there. The tail, still low, gave one slow movement side to side, not quick, not high, but enough to mark the moment as different. Mateo did not move to close the gap. This was the dog's choice, and choice was what trust was built on. The meat remained untouched for now, the water undisturbed. What had changed was the distance, and the fact that the dog had been the one to shorten it. They stayed like that for several minutes, a silent agreement holding in the space between them. The stakes were no lighter for it. The dog was still underweight, still exposed to the cold nights and long days without shelter. If fear overtook him, he could vanish into the fields, and every step forward would be lost. But the willingness to close even part of the distance suggested something more resilient than fear alone. Eventually, the dog lowered his head toward the meat. His nostrils flared once, twice, then he stepped back again, leaving it where it lay. Mateo didn't move to encourage him. The act of coming closer was enough for one day. If the food was taken later, when Mateo had gone, it would still serve its purpose. The important part had already happened. When Mateo finally rose, he did so slowly, avoiding any sudden motion. The dog's eyes followed him, but his body remained in place. Mateo crossed back over the ditch, turning toward the track that led further along the boundary. He didn't look back immediately, letting the dog decide whether to watch him leave or return to his vigil. After 20 paces, he glanced over his shoulder. The dog was still standing, head slightly lowered, watching from the edge of the gravel. It was a small change, no more than a few feet closed. A tail moved once, a posture shifted from stillness to measured approach. But in work like this, small changes carried weight. They were the markers that a line had been crossed, not in dominance or control, but in the first quiet steps of trust. Tomorrow the distance might shrink again, or it might not. Either way, the ground between them was different now. It had been walked. The morning broke clear, the air cool enough that the gravel still held the damp from nightfall. As Mateo rounded the familiar bend, he saw the dog not in his usual upright watch, but lying stretched across the edge of the road, head resting on his paws. His eyes opened at the sound of Mateo's steps, but there was no lift of the head, no shift to rise. The stillness was not one of focus, but of fatigue. Mateo slowed and crossed the ditch without pause, keeping his movements measured. The dog's gaze followed him, but the body remained low, ribs moving under each slow breath. He was thinner now, the lines of his frame sharper, but the eyes held him there as much as his own will. The posture spoke plainly. The vigil had worn him down. If he did not move soon, the strength to do so might be lost entirely. Kneeling beside him, Mateo set down the canteen and the small packet of food, but he didn't wait for the usual pause. He reached forward, letting his hand rest for a moment on the gravel between them. The dog's nose twitched, his gaze steady. Mateo's voice was soft, even. "It's okay." The words carried no pressure, only an opening. When his hand touched the coarse fur at the base of the dog's neck, there was no flinch, no backward shift. The coat was rough, the skin beneath cool from lying on the damp ground. Mateo's fingers worked gently, finding the angle beneath the chest where he could lift without strain. The dog's weight was lighter than it should have been, his legs folding loosely as Mateo gathered him. A faint exhale came from the animal as his head settled against Mateo's arm. Crossing back over the ditch was slow work, careful to keep the dog's body steady. The truck waited on the track, its bed lined with an old blanket folded twice. Mateo lowered the dog onto it, adjusting his position so the spine rested flat and the legs could stretch. The dog shifted once, curling slightly. then stilled. His eyes half closed, but they did not lose track of Mateo's movements. The door closed softly, the engine turning over with a low hum. As the truck rolled forward, the dog's head lifted for a moment, looking toward the road they were leaving. Then it lowered again, settling on the blanket. Mateo glanced in the mirror now and then, watching for signs of unease. None came. The only movement was the steady rise and fall of breath. The ride was unhurried, the tires moving gently over the track to keep the bed steady. Fields stretched on either side, their grasses bending with the light wind. The dog stayed as he was, his body neither tense nor fully relaxed, balanced in the unfamiliar space between. Mateo spoke once more, quiet enough that the sound did not break the stillness. "You can rest now." Each mile carried them farther from the bend, the place that had been both his anchor and his risk. Mateo thought of the days the dog had spent there, in sun, in rain, in wind, holding to a patch of ground that had given nothing back. That endurance had kept him alive, but it had also kept him alone. The ride, now, was the first break in that cycle. When the truck reached the turn toward the small rescue yard, the dog shifted slightly, lifting his head to look around. The scent of other animals hung faint in the air, carried from beyond the fence. Mateo slowed the vehicle, letting the change in surroundings arrive gradually. The bed's blanket rustled as the dog adjusted his position, but there was still no sign of resistance. The gate swung open with a muted creak, and the truck eased inside. Mateo parked beneath the shade of a low tree, cutting the engine. He stepped to the back, meeting the dog's eyes once more before reaching in. The animal allowed himself to be lifted again, his weight as light in Mateo's arms as it had been on the road. The blanket came with him, a small carryover of the ride's quiet. The ground here was firm but dry, the grass close-cropped. Mateo set the dog down gently, letting him stand if he chose. The paws shifted once on the dirt, testing the new ground. His gaze moved across the yard, then back toward Mateo. The ride was over, but the change it marked was not. For the first time in days, the dog was somewhere other than that single patch of gravel. And in rescue, change in place was often the first step toward change in life. The yard was quiet in the early light, the chain-link fence casting thin shadows across the packed earth. Mateo set a shallow basin near the corner where the shade would last longest. The dog stood a few paces away, his body angled toward the open space beyond the gate, as if measuring the distance back to the road. When the sound of water pouring reached him, his head turned, ears shifting forward. He approached without hurry, each step deliberate. At the basin's edge, he lowered his head and drank in slow, steady pulls, pausing often to swallow. The water rippled with each breath he took between mouthfuls. When he had finished, he stepped back, his paws leaving faint prints in the dust. Mateo left him there, moving to check the far side of the enclosure, giving him space to decide his next position. By mid-morning, the dog had chosen the far corner, settling into a curl against the fence line. His tail wrapped close to his body, head resting on his forelegs. The spot gave him a view of the gate, the open stretch beyond just visible through the mesh. He slept in short intervals, waking to lift his head whenever Mateo crossed the yard. The watchfulness was still there, but it was tempered by rest, the kind that came when immediate threats were fewer. In the days that followed, the routine took shape. Mateo brought food and water at the same time, placing them where the dog could see from his corner. At first, the meals were eaten only after Mateo had stepped well away, but the distance shortened a little each day. The dog's frame began to fill out slowly, the sharpness of his ribs softening under the coat as he took in more than the bare minimum to survive. By the end of the first week, he had started to follow. Not close, not pressing against Mateo's side, but moving in his direction whenever he walked from one gate to another. At first, it was only a few paces before he would stop and return to his corner. Then, gradually, the path extended. He would walk to the gate itself, standing behind Mateo as he checked the latch, his head turning to scan the open ground beyond. The road was nowhere in sight here. The fence and outbuildings blocked it entirely, but the habit of looking outward remained. The change was measured in these quiet actions, not in sudden gestures. He no longer lay fixed in a single spot all day. His range had expanded to include the shade beneath the tree, the patch near the feed shed, and the narrow strip by the water trough. Each place gave him a different view, a different scent carried on the wind. The yard was not yet claimed as his own, but it was no longer only a place he had been brought to. Still, the stakes had not eased completely. A dog that had anchored himself to one location for so long could decide to leave again if the chance came, driven by the same pull that had kept him at the roadside. Mateo made sure the gates were secure, not out of mistrust, but to keep the decision to stay from being tested too soon. The balance between freedom and safety was delicate. Forcing either could undo the progress. On cooler evenings, Mateo would sit near the center of the yard, letting the dog approach if he chose. Sometimes he would settle a few feet away, lying with his body angled toward the gate. Other times he would remain under the tree, watching. The following grew easier to read, not just caution, but curiosity, a weighing of Mateo's movements and patterns. Trust, in its early form, often looked like this, the willingness to share space without command or restraint. One morning, as Mateo moved between the feed shed and the far gate, he heard the light pad of paws behind him. The dog walked the length of the yard without stopping, keeping a steady pace until they reached the corner. When Mateo turned, the dog stood just inside arm's reach, his gaze steady. There was no tail movement, no obvious sign, but the nearness itself was a statement. The road was gone from sight here, hidden behind fences and distance. Whether he knew it or not, the choice to follow within these boundaries marked a turning. If he stayed, the waiting that had defined his days would end. For now, he remained, and that was enough to hold. The season had shifted. The mornings were warmer now. The grass in the back field grew high enough to ripple when the wind passed through. Mateo crossed the yard with the gate open behind him, a worn leather lead in his hand, though it had rarely been needed these past weeks. The dog trotted ahead without hesitation, tail lifted, the rhythm of his gait steady. They reached the far edge of the property where the fence opened to a wide stretch of field. It had been unused for seasons, the ground left to its own growth. Mateo stepped through first, glancing once over his shoulder. The dog followed, ears forward, eyes sweeping across the open space. His movements held a lightness that had not been there before. No stiffness from long stillness, no hesitation as though waiting for something to appear on the horizon. Mateo started at an easy pace. Within moments, the dog was beside him, then just ahead, his tail moving high in the wind. The dry stalks brushed against his legs as he ran, their tops breaking and swaying under his steps. Mateo matched his stride, not to keep up, but to share the ground in motion. The sound of paws on the earth carried clearly in the open air. The field stretched wide, the far fence barely visible through the wavering heat that had begun to rise from the soil. Each time the dog glanced toward Mateo, it was only brief, a check before turning his head forward again. The checks had a different quality now, not the measuring of distance for safety, but the acknowledgement of shared direction. They slowed near the center where the grass thinned and the ground dipped slightly. The dog stopped to scent the air, his chest rising and falling with each pull. Mateo rested a hand on his knee, watching him scan the space. There was no road here, no sound of engines, only the wind and the faint rustle of insects moving in the grass. The absence was its own kind of weight, a quiet that could settle into the body. When the dog began to move again, it was in a broad arc, circling back toward Mateo before stretching out into another run. His tail stayed high, the set of his body loose and fluid. The cornered stillness that had marked his early days was gone. In its place was a range of movement that reached beyond the small patch of gravel where he had once anchored himself. Matteo followed at a slower pace, letting the distance open. He knew the path back to the yard was direct, but he also knew this space was part of the change. Running here, the dog was not looking over his shoulder for a shape in the distance. He was not pausing at every sound. Whatever held him to that roadside had loosened enough for him to leave it behind. Near the far fence, the dog turned again, trotting back until they met near the middle. His tongue hung to the side, his breathing quick but steady. He brushed past Matteo's leg, the contact brief but certain, before heading toward the line of trees that marked the property's edge. Matteo let him explore until the shadows reached across the grass, then called softly. The dog paused, turned, and began the run back. They crossed the field together, the sun lowering at their backs. The wind carried the faint smell of dry earth and growing things, nothing of the dust and exhaust that had once been his constant view. Matteo could picture that place still. The bend in the road, the worn patch of gravel, the thin figure holding his ground against weather and time. It was far from here now, yet it lived in the same way a scar lives under the skin, not to be reopened, but not forgotten. At the yard gate, the dog slowed, stepping through without pause. His tail dropped to a relaxed sway as he crossed to the water basin. Matteo closed the gate behind them, the latch clicking softly. The field lay quiet beyond, the grass still moving where they had passed. The road was far behind them. Matteo knew the dog would not wait there again. But he also knew the shape of that waiting would remain inside him, part of the distance they had walked and run together. In rescue, some places were left physically but carried for life.